On the morning of Tuesday, the 22nd of August, 1911, a French painter named Louis Beroud walked into the Salon Carre on the second floor of the Louvre to sketch a copy of the Mona Lisa for one of his own paintings. He arrived at the spot where the painting had been hanging for over half a century. He looked at the wall. There were 4 iron hooks in the plaster where the painting's frame had been mounted. There was a slightly darker rectangle in the wallpaper where the painting had hung. There was no painting. Beroud assumed the work had been temporarily removed for cleaning or photography. He asked a guard. The guard checked. The guard discovered that nobody at the Louvre had any idea where the Mona Lisa was. At 11 that morning, the curators officially declared the painting missing. By the next day, the entire French press was reporting it. By the end of the week, it was front-page news on every continent. The painting would remain missing for 28 months. By the time it was recovered, it was no longer one of dozens of Leonardo paintings of moderate fame. It was without exception the most famous painting in the world. Before the 22nd of August, 1911, the Mona Lisa was a famous painting, but not extraordinarily famous. It was one of about a dozen surviving Leonardo paintings alongside the Virgin of the Rocks, the Last Supper, the Madonna and Child with St. Anne, and the Lost Battle of Anghiari. Within the Louvre's collection of 350,000 objects, it was a significant work, but not a singular icon. After the 22nd of August, 1911, the painting was transformed by the public fascination of the Manhunt, by the spread of newspaper photography, by the involvement of internationally famous suspects, and by the dramatic recovery into the singular icon it remains today. The painting was not made famous by the painter, it was made famous by the theft. To understand how the Mona Lisa was stolen, you have to understand the Louvre as a working institution in 1911. The Louvre at that time was a converted royal palace that had become a public museum during the French Revolution. By 1911, it housed roughly 250,000 cataloged objects and several thousand paintings, sculptures, and antiquities not yet cataloged. The institution's security in 1911 was, by modern standards, almost non-existent. The Louvre employed approximately 200 attendants, guardians, to monitor over 50 galleries spread across multiple floors and wings. There were no electronic alarm systems. There were no security cameras, which would not be invented for another 50 years. There were no motion detectors. There were no after-hours guards in most of the galleries. Visitors could enter the museum carrying tools, bags, or large packages with no inspection. The paintings themselves were mostly hung from simple iron mounting hooks attached to wires. Larger paintings had 2-point or 4-point mounting. Smaller ones had a single wire. None of the works, including the Mona Lisa, had alarm wires running through them. Many were not even attached to security cables. The Louvre was also, in 1911, in the middle of a series of small embarrassments. In May of that year, 3 months before the theft, a French journalist had successfully infiltrated the museum and spent the night hiding inside it, climbing up onto a marble sarcophagus and waiting until closing time, then writing an article about how easy it was to evade the guardians. The story had been published in Le Matin and had embarrassed the Louvre administration. The museum's director, Théophile Homali, had publicly assured the press that the Louvre's security was adequate. He had argued that the institution did not need additional resources because, in his words, no one could possibly steal the Mona Lisa. On the 22nd of August, 1911, somebody did. The thief was a 30-year-old Italian house painter, glazier, and former Louvre employee named Vincenzo Perugia. He was born in 1881 in Dimenza, a small village in the northern Italian province of Verfrisi near the Swiss border. He had moved to Paris in 1908 to find work as a tradesman. Perugia had been hired by the Louvre as a contractor in 1908 to install protective glass over a series of Italian Renaissance paintings, including the Mona Lisa. The Louvre, concerned about damage from visitors touching paintings, had decided to mount certain key works in glazed wooden boxes. Perugia was one of the workmen who built and installed these boxes. He spent several months working inside the museum during 1908. He knew the building's interior, the schedules of the guardians, and the specific locations of the most important works. After his contract ended, Perugia returned to general construction and house painting work in Paris. He lived in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. He was, by all subsequent accounts, a quiet, sober, unremarkable man. Perugia's motive for the theft has been disputed and reframed in different ways across the past century. The simplest account, the one he himself gave at his eventual trial, was patriotic. He believed incorrectly that the Mona Lisa had been stolen from Italy by Napoleon during the Napoleonic occupation of northern Italy, and that the painting rightfully belonged in Italy. He intended to return it to its Italian homeland. The patriotic account is partly true and partly false. The painting had indeed been transported from Italy to France, but not by Napoleon. Leonardo da Vinci himself had brought the painting along with several other works to France in 1516 when he accepted an appointment at the court of King Francis I. Leonardo died in France in 1519, and Francis I purchased the painting from Leonardo's estate. The painting had been part of the French royal collection for nearly 400 years before the 1911 theft. It had never been stolen. Perugia, however, believed the Napoleonic theft story. The story was widely circulated in early 20th century working-class Italian circles, partly as a folk political narrative about French imperial appropriation of Italian heritage, partly because it served various 20th century Italian nationalist agendas. Perugia had absorbed the belief and acted on it. At his trial in 1914, he claimed his motive was entirely patriotic. There was no expectation of personal profit. The actual theft was, in his telling, a kind of cultural restoration. The Louvre is closed to the public on Mondays. The museum is closed for cleaning, maintenance, and any building work. Mondays are when contractors and tradesmen work inside the building. On Monday, the 21st of August, 1911, the Louvre is closed. Perugia entered the museum that Monday morning through one of the employee entrances. He was wearing a white workman's smock, the standard uniform of Louvre maintenance contractors, and he was carrying tools. He moved unchallenged through the museum. Since contractors moved freely through the building on Mondays and his white smock was the universal uniform, he went directly to the Salon Carre on the second floor where the Mona Lisa was hanging. He waited until the gallery was empty. He lifted the painting, frame glass cover, and panel off its wall mountings. He walked it into an adjacent service corridor. He used a screwdriver to remove the painting from its frame and protective glass. He left the frame in the service corridor. The painting, without its frame, was a poplar wood panel measuring 30 inches by 21 inches. It weighed approximately 18 pounds. Perugia wrapped it in his white smock and tucked it under his arm. He then walked out of the museum through the same employee entrance, carrying the painting visibly. He was seen by at least one guard on his way out. The guard recognized him as a tradesman, did not stop him, did not search him. Perugia walked across the museum courtyard, out the gate, and onto the Rue de Rivoli with the most famous painting in the world tucked under his arm. Perugia took the painting back to his apartment building at 5 Rue de l'Hôpital St. Louis in the 10th arrondissement. He carried it up the stairs to his small flat. He hid the painting under the floor of a trunk in his apartment, then closed the trunk lid. For the next 28 months, the Mona Lisa lived in a wooden trunk in a working-class Parisian apartment about 3 miles from the Louvre. The theft itself was not discovered for almost 27 hours. The painting was lifted off the wall on Monday morning, the 21st of August, 1911. The Louvre reopened on Tuesday morning, the 22nd of August. By the time Louis Beroud walked into the Salon Carre at around 9 in the morning on Tuesday, the painting had been missing for over a day, and nobody at the museum had noticed. The Louvre's response was initially to assume the painting had been moved internally, to the photography studio, to a conservation lab, to temporary storage during a wall painting project. Senior staff spent several hours searching the building before concluding, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that the painting was genuinely missing. The director, Théophile Hamal, was on vacation. The acting director declared the painting stolen and notified the Paris Police Prefecture. The Paris police investigation that followed was one of the largest single art theft investigations in history up to that point. The case was assigned to Inspector Octave Hammerd and to a team of approximately 60 detectives from the Sûreté Générale. The first major problem was that nobody had a clear description of the thief. There were no witnesses to the actual removal of the painting from the gallery. There were no fingerprints, since fingerprint analysis was a new technique and the Louvre surfaces had been wiped down by museum cleaners after the painting was reported missing. The painting itself was gone, so it could not be used as evidence. Investigators were left with little to go on. They began by interviewing every Louvre employee, every contractor who had worked in the museum in the past 3 years, and every regular visitor who could be identified. They produced a list of approximately 257 individuals of investigative interest. Vincenzo Perugia, was one of them. Detectives interviewed Perugia at his apartment on the 23rd of November, 1911, 3 months after the theft. He gave the standard answers. He had worked at the Louvre as a contractor in 1908. He had not been back to the museum since. He had no knowledge of the theft. The detectives took his statement, did not search his apartment, where the painting was in the trunk, perhaps 20 feet from where they stood, and left. Perugia was cleared as a suspect. He had passed the interview because the detectives, working from a profile of potential thief with access, had been looking for somebody with sophisticated criminal connections or motives. A simple workman with patriotic delusions was not who they were looking for. Two other suspects became central to the case in different ways. The first was the avant-garde poet Guillaume Apollinaire. Apollinaire was a Polish-born French writer who, at age 31, was already a leading figure in the early Cubist movement. He had been romantically involved with the painter Marie Laurencin and was friends with most of the Paris avant-garde of the early 1910 seconds. In September 1911, Apollinaire was named in the press as a suspect because of an unrelated affair involving the theft of two small Iberian sculptures from the Louvre by a young Belgian writer named Honor-Joseph Gary Pierret, who had been a friend of Apollinaire's. Apollinaire was arrested on the 7th of September 1911 and held in the Santé prison in Paris for nearly a week. During his interrogation, he implicated his close friend, a Spanish painter living in Paris named Pablo Picasso. Picasso, then 29 years old, had bought one of the stolen Iberian sculptures from Pierret and used it as a model for elements of his then radical painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Picasso was called in for questioning. By accounts subsequent biographers reconstructed from his and Apollinaire's letters, Picasso panicked, denied knowing Apollinaire, and tried to dispose of the small Iberian sculpture in the scene. The French police, investigating two separate art theft cases in parallel, the major Mona Lisa case and the minor Iberian sculptures case, briefly suspected Picasso and Apollinaire might be connected to both. They were not. Picasso and Apollinaire had nothing to do with the Mona Lisa theft, but their involvement in the smaller Iberian sculpture case briefly turned both men into international news. Apollinaire was eventually released. Picasso was never charged. The Iberian sculptures were returned to the Louvre. Both men were left with the embarrassment of having been press paraded as art thieves. But the suspicion of Picasso and Apollinaire is, retrospectively, one of the more striking footnotes of the Mona Lisa investigation. The two men who would go on to become two of the most important figures in 20th century European avant-garde culture were, for 1 week in September 1911, the world's most prominent art theft suspects in a case that had nothing to do with them. The investigation continued through 1912 and 1913. The Paris police produced thousands of leads, none of which led to the painting. The Louvre offered substantial rewards for information. The French press maintained almost continuous coverage of the case. Tourist visits to the Louvre Salon Carre actually increased after the theft. Visitors came specifically to see the empty wall where the Mona Lisa had hung. The painting during this time remained in Vincenzo Perugia's trunk. Perugia continued to live his ordinary life as a Paris workman. He continued to receive his rent, eat his meals, go to his job at small construction sites around the city. He was, by every account that emerged later, completely unprepared for the next stage of the theft. He had imagined that he would simply return the painting to Italy and be hailed as a patriot. He had not worked out a specific plan for actually doing that. By 1913, the painting had been in his apartment for nearly 2 years. He was running out of patience and money. He decided to attempt to sell the painting to an Italian art dealer. In late November 1913, Perugia wrote a letter to Alfredo Geri, an antiques dealer in Florence. The letter was signed only with the initial Leonardo. It announced that the writer was in possession of the missing Mona Lisa and was prepared to return it to Italy on suitable terms. Geri, who had received a stream of crank letters about the case over the previous 2 years, was initially skeptical. He consulted with Giovanni Paghi, the director of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Both men decided to respond to the letter. They invited Perugia to bring the painting to Florence for examination. On the 10th of December 1913, Perugia traveled by train from Paris to Florence, carrying the Mona Lisa wrapped in a red velvet cloth in a small wooden trunk in the third-class luggage compartment. He checked into the Hotel Tripoli, Italia in Florence, now the Hotel La Gioconda. On the 11th of December 1913, Perugia met Geri and Paghi in his hotel room. He showed them the painting. They confirmed on the spot that it was the missing Mona Lisa. They could compare it to known photographs and to the wax seals on the back of the panel from the Louvre's records. They told Perugia they needed to take the painting back to the Uffizi for further examination. He let them. They then immediately reported him to the Florence police. Perugia was arrested at the Hotel Tripoli Italia. The painting was secured in the vault of the Uffizi. The recovery of the Mona Lisa was announced to the world on the 12th of December, 1913. The painting was put on display at the Uffizi for a week before being returned to France. Approximately 60,000 people came to see it during that week. The Italian government issued a formal apology to France for the theft. The French government, in return, formally requested the painting's return. The painting was returned to France on the 31st of December, 1913. It traveled by special train from Florence to Paris with armed escort through both Italy and France. Crowds lined the train route in several places. It arrived in Paris on the 1st of January, 1914, and was reinstalled in the Salon Carre at the Louvre with a major public ceremony. Perugia was tried in Florence in June 1914. The Italian court treated him with extraordinary leniency. He was charged not with grand theft, but with a lesser offense roughly equivalent to abuse of office. Since he was technically a former Louvre employee, he was sentenced to 1 year and 15 days in prison. The sentence was reduced on appeal to 7 months and 9 days. Since he had already been held in pretrial detention for that long, he was released immediately after the verdict. The Italian press and public received Perugia not as a thief but as a patriotic figure. In editorials in many Italian newspapers, he was framed as a working-class Italian who had attempted, clumsily but sincerely, to return an Italian masterpiece to its rightful home. The fact that the painting had never been Italian, found in the first place that Leonardo himself had taken it to France, was either downplayed or simply ignored. After his release, Perugia served in the Italian army during the First World War. He returned to France after the war and resumed his career as a house painter in Paris. He died in 1925 in Saint-Maur-des-Fosses, near Paris, at the age of 44. He left no memoir, no extended explanation of his motives, no further communication with the press. He took to the grave whatever further details of the theft and its planning he had not disclosed at the trial. The recovery of the Mona Lisa restored the painting to its position on the Louvre wall. But it also did something else. It transformed the painting into the single most famous artwork in the world in a way that no curatorial decision, no marketing campaign, and no critical reevaluation could have accomplished. The transformation worked through several specific mechanisms. 1. Newspaper photography. The 1911 theft happened at exactly the moment when major newspapers were beginning to print high-quality photographs alongside text. Pictures of the missing painting, with the empty wall behind it, with the Florentine hotel where it was recovered, with a special train returning it to Paris, were on the front pages of newspapers on every continent. For the first time in history, almost everybody in the literate Western world had seen in newspaper print an image of a specific Italian Renaissance painting. The painting acquired a mass media footprint that, in 1911, no other artwork had. 2. The drama of the Manhunt, the 28-month gap between theft and recovery, gave the world plenty of time to fixate on the painting. Speculation about who had stolen it, where it might be, whether it would ever be recovered, kept the painting in the public mind continuously by the time it was recovered. The recovery itself was a world event. 3. The patriotic frame, Perugia's stated motive, that the painting was being returned to its true Italian home, gave the recovery a powerful narrative frame. The painting became, in the public imagination, not just a Leonardo painting, but an object that nations themselves had fought over. In the years following the recovery, attendance at the Louvre soared specifically. Attendance in the room containing the Mona Lisa rose by orders of magnitude. By 1925, the painting was being viewed by approximately 500,000 visitors a year. By the 1962nd, it had become the single object that, in the US and European travel imagination, was synonymous with the Louvre itself. By 2019, the Louvre's last pre-pandemic year, the painting was viewed by an estimated 8 million people. The average time a visitor spent in front of it was 15 seconds. The painting is now displayed behind multiple layers of bulletproof glass, in a specially controlled humidified case, behind a barrier rope that keeps visitors approximately 10 feet from the panel. Most visitors see it primarily through their phone cameras, photographing the protected painting before moving on. None of this would have happened in this form without the 1911 theft. The painting that had hung in the Louvre for almost 4 centuries without becoming a world icon became, in the years following the theft, the world icon. Vincenzo Perugia, the unimaginative Italian house painter who carried the Mona Lisa under his arm out of the Louvre on the 21st of August, 1911, did not understand what he had done. He believed he had returned a piece of Italian heritage. He had actually, through clumsiness, patriotism. 2 years of indecision and the accumulating force of mass media transformed a single Italian Renaissance portrait into the most famous painting on earth. The painting hangs back on the Louvre wall. The 4 iron hooks from 1911 are gone, replaced by a complex modern mounting system in a sealed case. The slightly faded rectangle in the wallpaper has been repainted over. The painting looks now as Perugia could not have imagined it would look, at the center of a permanent crowd. Photographed without ceasing, the object of pilgrimage for tens of millions of people every year, not because of its technique or its history, but because for 28 months in 1911 and 1913 it was missing.